What's up everyone? Today we're going to learn about HTML, and before we actually dive into the code, let's give some context. So HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language, basically changed the way that we use computers. Previously, you didn't have an option to go on the internet and browse some stuff. Before HTML and web browsers, all applications were essentially desktop applications and they were not connected to each other. And with the advent of HTML, anyone with a text editor and a way to host HTML files could actually create a content and share it with the world. I have already mentioned what HTML stands for, which is Hypertext Markup Language. Let's talk about what hypertext is. And it is basically a text with a bunch of links. So when you go to the website, you see a bunch of different links that you can click on and essentially go to some external resource. So what hypertext is just a text with a bunch of those links, which are also called hyperlinks. And this is what makes web a web. You have a page that links to other pages and other pages links to other pages, and all of that basically are connected to each other with those links. Now let's talk about markup. And markup is basically a system to annotate a document so it could be processed for display. And HTML, as you will see in a minute, is basically a bunch of instructions to the browser so that it could properly process, structure, and display your content. HTML is one of 3 core technologies that you'll need to learn in order to build a professional looking website. And if we think of websites as buildings, HTML is going to be our walls. It's basically how we're going to structure our building. Another 2 technologies that we'll need to learn is going to be CSS, which is basically how you are going to paint those walls and decide how big those walls should be, and JavaScript, which is going to be the logic for our website. Or you can think of that as smart devices in our building, like clapping twice in order to turn on the lights. So going back to HTML, it is going to be the structure for our web page. We are only going to be covering HTML right now. I will cover CSS and JavaScript in later videos, as well as creating our first website and publishing it online. Alright, let's start with tools that we actually need in order to start writing HTML. And the first tool that we're going to talk about is actually going to be our browsers. We will need them in order to actually view our work, and one of the options that we have is going to be Google Chrome, and another one is going to be Mozilla Firefox. Both of these options work great, so go ahead and install either of those two. However, most of the modern browsers are actually going to work pretty well. Next tool that we're going to need is going to be our editor. What are editors? Basically a program that will allow us to write code in it. And you can absolutely use something like TextEdit if you're on Mac or Notepad if you're on Windows, but these are bare-bone tools that don't really have much to it. Instead, programmers use code editors that will assist them in writing code in different languages much faster. Some of the most popular options are VS Code, Visual Studio Code, Sublime, or Atom. We can actually see how we can download them over here. So this is where you can download the Visual Studio Code or VS Code, and it is available on all different platforms. And this is my go-to editor, and I will be using it during this tutorial. And other options that are available for you are going to be Sublime Text Editor or Atom. Both of these editors are great, but don't really stress too much about the editors, because there is a constant debate going on which editor is better, but honestly just pick the one that you like and pick the one that you're comfortable with. But if you don't feel like downloading anything, there are online options such as CodePen or Replit. These are also great, I've used them before, so go ahead and choose the one that you like, and I'll see you in a second. So after you have downloaded your coding editor, go ahead and create a new folder, call it HTML tutorial, and open your coding editor. And in this tutorial we're going to be using VS Code as our coding editor, and once you first open it, it will actually greet you with that welcome screen. And in this welcome screen you have different options to create new file, open folder, recent history, some help options. You can actually toggle this on and off in case you don't want that welcome screen to show up on the startup. You have an option to customize your coding editor, and there are also some learn options, so we can actually find different commands that are going to be useful for you once you start writing code. So now what I want you to do is go ahead, click on that open folder, go ahead, locate your folder that you've created previously and open it. And you can close that welcome screen since we're not going to be using that anymore. So let's explore the UI real quick. In the top left corner, we're actually going to have the Explorer, which is currently open right now. And here you will have all the files or contents of that folder that you have open. Next, we have that search option in case you want to search for something in your code. And we're not going to talk about these two options. This is essentially the source control and the debug menu, but we're quickly going to talk about that option, which is going to be extensions. And extensions is why VS Code is super popular. They basically make your life easier as a developer, so they give you a bunch of different tools to quickly write your code. And we will be exploring that later, but today we're actually not going to be using them. So let's go back to Explorer. And inside of the Explorer, what I want you to do is go ahead and click that option over here, which is actually going to create a new file and call it index.html. And we're not going to go in depth on why we're calling that index, but think of that as sort of like a convention, basically the first file that you're going to create. And the reason why we have the .html extension is so that browsers are actually able to identify that this is an HTML file, so they properly structure your page. So now what I want you to do is go ahead, right click on the file, click Reveal in Finder, right click on it again, click Open With, and select your browser. What it's going to do is it will actually open it up in your browser, and here you will actually be able to see your work. So let's go back to our code. And the first thing I want you to do is go ahead and write something in there, right? We're going to write a simple hello. And one thing to note here is that we have that white circle over here, and once I hover over it, it becomes a cross. So that white circle means that file hasn't been saved yet. So everything that you've typed, you need to actually save it so it could be reflected in your browser. So let's go ahead and save it by pressing Command S or Control S if you're on Windows. And let's go back to our browser. So notice we still have that blank page. In order to actually see the changes that you've made to your HTML file, what you need to do is actually refresh your browser. And now you see that hello over here. So this is pretty much the simplest you can go with HTML just by writing some text in it. But let's take a look over here. What if I keep writing hello on every single line? I'm going to save the file. I'm going to go back to the browser. I'm going to refresh it. One thing that I'll see is they will still appear on one single line. And the reason why this is happening is because browsers don't really see that white space over here. So every time you hit a new line and hit save and go back to the browser and refresh, you won't see that change. And in order to actually structure the page the way that you'd like, you need to use HTML. So let's go back to our coding editor and start writing our HTML. I'm actually going to remove everything. And I want to start by saying that HTML has three core components. One is called tags. Next one is going to be elements. And the third one is going to be attributes. So tags are basically keywords that tell browser how to display the content. And the syntax for writing tags would be opening angle bracket, the name of the tag, and the closing angle bracket. And notice that VS Code actually auto-completed the second portion of the tag for me. So most of the tags are actually going to come in pairs. They're going to have an opening portion, this bit, and the closing portion. And the difference between them is that the closing tag is actually going to have / at the beginning of the name of the tag. So now let's talk about how you actually put content inside of these tags. And basically the way that you do it is by writing the stuff that you want to display between these tags, basically like a sandwich. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to remove these lines over here, save the file, and go back to our browser. Let's hit the refresh button to actually see these changes, and boom! Now you have hello written in bold at the top of the page. And the reason why it's written big and bold is because H1 tag stands for the heading tag. So now our content that would put between those tags is actually going to display as a heading. And we're going to talk about different headings that we actually can use inside of the HTML. So now let's go back to the code and talk about what the element is. And actually you can remove that empty line, save the file. It doesn't really make any difference because browsers ignore empty lines as we've seen before. So now let's talk about elements. And elements is basically going to be your tags plus the content between these tags. So that whole line 1 is actually going to be your element. So once again, elements consist of tags and content between these tags. The last core component for writing HTML is going to be attributes. And attributes basically give additional information about the element. Every HTML element can have attributes, but we only use them when we need to. And most of the common ones are going to be ID and class that we use to identify one element or a group of different elements within your HTML document. So let's go over the syntax of how to write attributes. And to write attributes, you actually write them inside of the opening tag right after the tag name. And the way that you do it is by specifying the name of the attribute, let's say ID, followed by the equal sign, then you hit single or double quotes and you write the value for the attribute. So we can actually write potato. So now this element has an attribute of ID with a value of potato. And that syntax is actually going to be similar to how you write every single attribute. And now notice one thing. Once I hover, and I'm not sure if this is going to be true for other editors, but once I hover over the name of the attribute, VS Code actually gives the definition of that attribute and what it means. And also it gives the MDN reference. So let's talk about that real quick. So if we click on that and click open, it will bring us to the MDN web documentation. And MDN web documentation is actually something that we will be referencing a lot, and I definitely encourage you to actually go ahead and explore that if you're serious about learning HTML, because as a programmer, this is what you're going to be doing on a daily basis. And here you can actually read about the ID attribute. It actually has some HTML over here, so we can go ahead and play around with it, and a bunch of other cool stuff. So go ahead and play around with it. Also, MDN has a pretty cool page on HTML basics that actually explains what is HTML, and also it explains anatomy of an HTML element. Basically the exact same thing we were talking about before. So HTML element consists of opening tag, content, and a closing tag. But enough of documentation. I know this is not why you're here for today. Let's go back to code. So now let's actually explore different heading elements that we have. Go ahead and remove that H1 that we had before, and let's write different heading elements. And the first one is going to be H1. Go ahead and type in H1 and hit enter, and notice VS Code actually filled out the rest of the tag for you. And this is another reason why coding editors are great. So let's go ahead and write some content inside of it. I'm going to put hello H1, and the next thing what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to write a bunch of other heading elements. And in HTML, we actually have 6 of them. So H1 being the highest and H6 being the lowest. So let's go ahead and write them all out. And then I'll just put some content in them. Oops, it should be 5, H4, H3, H2, so that we can actually clearly see how different are they. So go ahead, save your file and go back to your browser and refresh it. And now you see the difference between these heading elements. One thing to note, they're all going to be in bold, but the font size is actually going to differ. And as you might notice, H6 and H5 are actually super small. You probably won't be using them a lot often. You most likely will be using H4 through H1. So let's go back to our code, and one thing that I want to mention once again is it goes from H1 to H6, so you don't have an option to create H7 or H8. Also, order of these elements is important, so if you put the H1 at the end, hit save and go back to the browser and refresh it, you'll see that hello H1 actually appears at the very end of the page. So we've talked about different heading tags and how we can use them, and you basically want to use them to represent different sections of the page. Now let's talk about how we can actually represent our text. And for that we'll be using a paragraph element. In order to write it, we'll be using a p tag. And now we can actually go ahead and write some text in it. And let's go ahead and just remove extra heading tags that we're not going to be using. Let's remove some white spaces. Let's save the file, go back to the page and refresh it. So every time you need to write block of text, use p tags for that. And another thing that I want to mention is if you don't feel like typing a bunch of text yourself, you can go ahead, delete that, type in lorem, hit enter, and VS Code basically will prefill your content with a bunch of Latin. So go ahead and click save, go back to the browser, refresh it, and boom, you have a bunch of text written for you. So let's go back to the code and explore different formatting options that are available for us. And we will be looking at these 4 tags. The first one is going to be EM, second one is I, then strong, and B. So let's put some content in and see how it's going to be different. We're just going to put hello everywhere. Go ahead, click save, go back to the browser and refresh it. And immediately what you can see is, even though in the code we've had these 4 elements written in their own tags, in their own lines, over here in the browser they're actually displayed in one single line. So why is that? And the reason for that is because HTML elements are actually divided in 2 different groups. One of them is going to be block level elements such as H1 and P tags. These 2 are block level elements, which means that they take as much space as they can. So if they have full width of the page available for them, they're actually going to take that full width of the page. And inline elements take as much space as they need to take, depending on how big the content of that element is. And since inline elements take only as much space as they need to take, they will be put next to each other on the same line. And there are a bunch of block level and inline level elements, and you can actually explore them over here at MDN if you search for block level versus inline level elements, and here you can actually find the list of them. But we're not going to spend too much time talking about that right now. We will be seeing more examples as we go. So now let's actually go ahead and talk about the difference between these 4 tags. One thing to note here is they are quite similar. And in fact, these 2 tags do the exact same thing and last 2 tags do the exact same thing. So what's the actual difference? So EM and I elements, they're both going to do a very similar thing. They're going to italicize your text. And as you saw before, EM and I element, they both do the exact same thing. They italicize your text, right? And as we can see here, that's exactly what's happening, right? But what's the actual difference between them? And the difference is semantics. So EM, which stands for emphasis, is basically emphasize your text, whereas I, which is idiomatic text element, is going to just set your text off for some reason. So you would use the I element in case you want to annotate some technical terms, for example. And the difference between strong and B elements is exactly the same. As you can see, these 2 elements are basically making your content look bold. So once again, the difference between these 2 elements is going to be semantics, and for strong elements is going to basically put some strong importance on that content, and the B element is just going to make that content appear in bold. And semantics are quite important, so if you just want your content to be visually different from the regular text, you can definitely use the B or I tags. But if you want to create some kind of emphasis, you need to use EM element, and if you want to create some kind of urgency or importance, then you need to use strong elements. And since you actually want to use these 4 elements to format your text, let's go ahead and format our paragraph. And with HTML, you can totally nest elements, and since these 4 elements that we've just learned about are inline elements, you can totally put them inside of that tag. So go ahead and create, I don't know, let's say I, and put hello in there. Go ahead, save the file. Let's go back to the browser and refresh it. And now you can see hello is actually being italicized, and it doesn't create any breaks because I element is inline element, and we've put it inside of our Latin text. So we've seen how to create headings, how to create paragraphs, and how to format text inside of that paragraph. But what if we want to split different blocks of text from each other? How can we do that? And remember previously when we tried to create some spaces and line breaks between different paragraphs or different elements, and that didn't really work out. And if we save that file right now and go back to the browser and refresh it, you can see that we're not seeing the white spaces between these 2 paragraphs. So what can we do in that case? Well, for that, what we can do is we can actually use the break element, and I'm actually going to remove these white spaces since we don't really need them anymore, and I'm going to introduce the new element called BR, which stands for break. So one thing to note here is that break element doesn't come with a closing tag, and in HTML we have two different types of tags, the one that have the closing portion and the one that do not have it, and the ones that do not have it, we call them self-closing tags. And break element is one of those examples. So let's actually see that in action. We're going to save the file, and before we actually save it, we're going to copy and paste it several times so that we can actually see the difference. We save the file, we go back to the browser, we refresh it, and now we see that we added a bunch of these line breaks. So basically what this element does is it adds line break to the content. And there is also another way of how we can actually add breaks between our paragraphs, and another way is by adding horizontal ruler or HR element. Notice this is also another example of self-closing tags. So if we save that file and we go back to the browser and refresh it, we're going to see that this line has been added to the content. So this is it for some basic tags, but before we move on, we need to actually properly structure our HTML. One thing to note, this is not exactly how you would want to write your HTML files, and we're going to cover how to properly write HTML files in the next video.